In 1940, director John Ford and star Henry Fonda gave the world a dramatic depiction of the disastrous downturn of the 1930s West.
In 2022, we try a bourbon with wrathful grapes of its own.
The film is Grapes of Wrath.
The whiskey is Rabbit Hole PX Finish.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are starting a mini-series of films by the director John Ford with his 1940 Oscar winner, The Grapes of Wrath. Brad, usually we watch movies for this podcast, at most a day or two before we record the episode.
Oh, yeah. But maybe 3 or 4 days.
Yeah, and maybe 30 minutes before. There have been times where I've finished the movie and, ran to my computer to get on and talk to you. Yeah. That is not the case today. This might be the longest we've ever gone after watching a movie before recording, and I'm kind of excited about it because, if I'm being honest, I don't remember, a damn thing that happens in this movie, Brad.
Do you want to know something that you'll be proud of me for?
Oh, yeah. Tell me.
I watched Tick, Tick, Boom the other day.
Oh, I like how you just completely changed the subject altogether.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about things I've done in the interim.
Oh.
And I could probably give a much better review of that movie than Grapes of Wrath right now.
What'd you think of it?
Solid with a really great performance from Garfield.
100%. That was one of those movies where, you could tell that Lin-Manuel Miranda is not a director yet. That was a movie that was totally made in the editing room.
Yes.
And Garfield holds the whole thing together.
Yeah, you can tell that he is coming into his own as an actor to the point where he can help a younger director.
For sure. Well, okay, let's try to find a way to segue from that 2021 film back to 1940 and talk about John Ford. So this season, we're doing mini-series by very famous directors, and John Ford is one of the most highly regarded directors of all time. It's been a while, Brad, since we have gone back to classic Hollywood, which is kind of the bread and butter of this podcast, or was for a number of seasons. So it's really nice to be back in the golden age of Hollywood. And this movie, The Grapes of Wrath, is widely considered one of Ford's best films. It was ranked as the 21st best American film of all time by the American Film Institute when they did their first top 100. And then when they revisited it 10 years later, it was number 23. So we're coming out to an average of the 22nd best film of all time. And I'm excited to talk about it. It's a great movie based on one of the quote unquote great American novels. I don't think we've had a movie with this amount of heft behind it in a long time on the show.
I was going to say, this is actually our second Steinbeck adaptation, though.
Yes, it is, behind East of Eden.
East of Eden, which is one of my absolute favorite books of all time. I've never read Grapes of Wrath, though.
I have also not read Grapes of Wrath. I'm pretty sure that this is the novel in which there's a whole chapter dedicated to a turtle that's turned on its back in the middle of the road struggling. And, of course, it's a metaphor. Do you get it? But no, I've never gotten through Grapes of Wrath.
Yeah, I was told this by a friend that the end of the book is much more bleak than the end of the movie.
Yeah.
Have you heard about the ending of this book?
So I read the Wikipedia page on the movie and it talked about differences from the novel, and my God, I thought this movie was crushingly sad. And that book, man, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and read the Cliff Notes or check out the Wikipedia page, because I'm not going to talk about the ending. It's pretty unique and very sad.
It's definitely a downer, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about the book as it relates to this movie as we get into this episode. But Brad, the question that is looming over every one of our episodes is, have you seen this movie before?
I have not.
All right. And have you seen any of the movies that we're doing in our Ford retrospective here?
Yeah, I've seen The Quiet Man.
Okay, so next week we're doing The Searchers, and then we're going to finish out with The Quiet Man. So you've seen that one, but not the other two.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That means that it is time for us to jump into Brad Explains, which is America's favorite segment. As we get into that, we do want to encourage you, whether this is your first time listening to the show or if you're a long-time listener, please check out our Patreon page, patreon.com/filmwhiskey, where you can support the podcast. You can give back a little, buy us a coffee once a month. You can support us at a $3, $5, or $7 a month tier. At every one of those tiers, you get access to a special Discord server that we're on literally every day, talking to fans of film and whiskey. Especially at the $5 and $7 tiers, you get bonus perks, which are really, really great. We'd love to have you join the community at patreon.com/filmwhiskey. Brad, I have vamped a little bit to give you time to formulate your thoughts, to try to reach into the recesses of your mind to remember what this movie's about.
More like the depths of my soul.
Yeah, right? We've put 60 seconds on the clock. Can you break down the plot of The Grapes of Wrath?
Yeah, Tom Joad, played by Henry Fonda, the illustrious Henry Fonda. He is a ex-convict. He killed a man in a bar fight. He returns to his family's farm in Oklahoma, only to find them driven off of it. He reunites with his family to realize that they are moving out west. There was a flyer that said that they would pay for, was it 800 orange pickers, I believe?
Mm-hmm.
And that they're getting an old truck that's just full of every single thing that they own, and they're taking it out west. On the way out west, they run into some people who tell them that what they're going to is a fantasy, that it's not actually real, it's an illusion. But they head on out anyways. A former pastor joins them
10
on
seconds.
the trip to see what's out there. And everything is sad and terrible, and the government's the only people you can trust. I think that's it.
I love that that's the lesson of the film.
I mean,
lean on Uncle Sam, folks.
That's kind of what they portrayed, man.
We have lots to talk about, Brad, don't we?
Yeah, this is an interesting film because all of the acting performances are stellar.
Oh, phenomenal.
Like we can start there. All of the acting performances are out of this world, just really, really good. And for me, that's what really kept this movie together. Because if I'm being honest, it feels a little rough around the edges, Bob.
It does, and I don't remember it being that way. I remember seeing this for the first time when I was probably in high school and really loving it. And I think, like, from a cinema standpoint, like the language of cinema, the visual language of this movie, we'll get into talking about the cinematographer, Greg Toland. Like, this movie looks amazing. I have never seen a movie that has so much of its scenes happen in utter darkness, where there's like so many layers of darkness and everything is kind of framed with just these tiny pinpoints of light. It's a gorgeous movie. I think the cinematic language is great, but I'm with you. Like, if I'm being honest, I think the first half of this movie was significantly more compelling than the second half of the movie.
Yes.
And the second half of the movie is like where the actual meat and potatoes of the story happens. So the movie felt for me like way more successful in the first half, where it was kind of like meditations on the plight of the average American at this time. Mm-hmm. It was just like, it was very bleak and it was incredibly sad. And I found myself choking up and crying at many, many points.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that like it's good because it's so sad, but it moved me. And then it kind of settles into a very small, intimate story about this one particular family. And I understand that family is supposed to be representative, right? But it felt more just like, hey, here's some things that happened to these few people. Mm-hmm. And I really struggled to care about those people the way that I cared about the characters in the first half of the movie.
Yeah, and to me, it got a little bit preachy at the end of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Like the way Henry Fonda delivers his speech to, Ma Joad, played by Jane Darwell.
Yeah.
The way he delivers his speech feels forced. And if I'm being honest, it feels almost like it doesn't represent the trials that they've been through. Mm-hmm. It almost feels like he's like, well, this is this is what America needs right now, so I'm going to give this nice speech to get everybody feeling better about life.
Yeah.
And I don't know if maybe that's just like the postmodern cynic in me, but...
So this is the great thing about doing this podcast, because, you come into a lot of these movies having never seen them before, and I would imagine not understanding some of the cultural impact of some of the films, right? But are you familiar with that speech in the history of movies? Like, that line is considered one of the most famous lines in the history of cinema. Like where he's talking about, wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there, and doing the whole I'll be there thing. It has been repeated and repeated and repeated for decades, to the point where, like, I couldn't believe the timing of this, Brad. Give me like 10 seconds for an aside here. Mm-hmm. I turned on an episode of Hey Arnold the other day. Do you remember that show from when we were kids?
Yes.
I loved Hey Arnold. And I was thinking about this episode with a character called Pigeon Man. Do you remember Pigeon Man?
I do remember Pigeon Man. I thought Pigeon Man was Doug.
It was what? No, that was Hey Arnold. It was one of the first episodes of TV that, as a kid, I was like, I feel emotional about this. And at the end of that episode, when Pigeon Man gets carried off into the sunset by his pigeons, he looks at Arnold and he starts talking about wherever there's a pigeon in need, I'll be there. And he does the whole Tom Joad speech. And I could not believe, maybe it was something that was buried in my subconscious, but I literally watched this 2 days ago and could not believe that the influence of that speech stretches even into children's media in the late 90s. You know what I mean?
1990s.
So anyway, all that to say, I agree with you. I do think that when I look at that speech, it doesn't feel authentic and organic to who the character of Tom Joad is.
Exactly.
Tom Joad is not an educated man, right? And you can tell in that moment that he's doing his best to kind of frame his new understanding of the unity of people together and how we all share a piece of the same big soul kind of a thing. It kind of reminds me of at the end of Forrest Gump, when Forrest Gump is talking to Jenny's grave, and he's like, is it what Mama says about everyone has a destiny, or is it like Lieutenant Dan says about we're all floating around gentle on a breeze? Maybe it's both. It kind of feels like they're trying to do that, where you're watching this character make this out in his own mind, but it just comes across as it's time for our main character to get on a soapbox for a little bit and make explicit what has already been made implicit. And I'm with you. For one of the most famous things ever, it doesn't totally work for me.
Yeah. And the thing is, yes, as he was giving it, I was like, oh, I've heard this a million times before. Even at the end of Dark Knight, when, it has that feel of not the hero that they wanted, but I'm the hero they need.
Yeah, that's hilarious, because I was thinking of that as my other point of reference here. That, it's time for Jim Gordon to step up and be let's frame this legendary character in legendary terms now.
Mm-hmm. And there's part of me that I can't blame, Grapes of Wrath for starting a trend, but what I can say is what you said, that it feels soapboxy, and it doesn't feel like it really fits, in my opinion, with all of the things that their family has experienced. That he would make that decision to run off and become a unionizer. I don't really know what he's doing, but he's going to do it, and he's going to do it great.
I think Henry Fonda might be kind of miscast as Tom Joad.
Oh, and he's way too educated.
He's way too educated, and Fonda works best in comedies, I think. So there's a great movie called The Lady Eve that he was in, where he's basically playing a I don't want to call him stuck up, but very naive and buttoned up person who gets seduced by Barbara Stanwyck. And it's hilarious, but watching him be innocent and get hot under the collar around Barbara Stanwyck is just so funny. And he just comes across as such an innocent, doe-eyed, baby-faced guy that I'm like, you didn't kill somebody in a bar fight. Come on, dude, you've never killed anyone. And throughout the movie, I just couldn't get over this fact that this guy is supposed to have this edgy past to him, because Henry Fonda is so much like the naive, innocent face of America that even somebody I feel like a Gary Cooper would have worked so much better in this role than Fonda. And I'm not saying Fonda gives a bad performance, but, you know, it's like watching Tom Hanks be the hitman in Road to Perdition. It's like, he's great. I just don't totally buy it.
I'm just not in. My boy Tommy Hanks, he's not killing anybody.
No, I don't see it.
No, I agree, man. He is just so charming. Like, I don't know if there's ever been an actor who has the soft-spoken charm of Henry Fonda. Like, there's other actors out there who are super charming, but he just has this way of looking at, you know, whoever he's with on screen and just kind of speaking quietly and calmly to them that you're just like, find yourself agreeing with him. Like, you're like, yeah, that totally makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. And there's something about that when it really kind of like rears its head at the very start when he gets in the truck with the guy and he's hitchhiking and he's like, you want to know what I did? And they like get into this fight for like 3 minutes of whether or not he will tell them what he did.
Right.
And he's like, well, mister, I'm not going to welch on telling you I killed a man. And I'm just kind of like, did you though?
Did you? Yeah.
Did you kill a guy?
So Henry Fonda had a very famous lifelong friendship with Jimmy Stewart. And Jimmy Stewart was very conservative. But like I've read articles before that's about their friendship and how their friendship transcended their very active political lives because they were both just really nice guys. And I think that's the thing where like you couldn't have Jimmy Stewart in this movie. And I think by the same token, Henry Fonda, as good as he is, as much as this is one of his most beloved, revered performances, I just can't shake that he might be kind of miscast here.
I wish that they had Jimmy Stewart as like one of the foreman evil guys at the camps.
All right, man, let's talk about the rest of this cast. And I think the place to start would be with Jane Darwell as Ma Joad.
Bro,
she wins an Oscar for this movie.
Okay, that's good to hear because this is one of the best like co-lead supporting performances, whatever you want to call it. By God, she is amazing.
I used to watch Turner Classic Movies all the time, like growing up. I just loved watching it. And in between movies, they would show these kind of like mini commercials or snippets of a documentary that they produced. And they had this thing that was called like 100 Years of the Movies, and they kept showing it forever. And the clip they showed from The Grapes of Wrath in this like, 5-minute montage was just the shot of her holding the earrings up to her ears in the mirror. And you just watch her face like fall. And that face of hers, man, it says so much about hopes and dreams and lost dreams and lost hopes and the hopes and dreams of America. Like every theme this movie is trying to shoot for, like finds its manifestation in that woman's face. It's crazy how much her demeanor and expressions like carry the film.
Yeah, I mean, her performance is incredibly sincere and authentic, and you can tell that she has been carrying the entire weight of this family on her back. Mm-hmm. That like the whole, jalopy that they're driving is actually like emotionally, all of that stuff is on her back. Mm-hmm. And she comes so close to cracking under the weight so many times in this movie. And just like you said, you just see it in her eyes, on her face, the way she talks to people, the way she pauses when she's struggling before she responds to somebody's question. Like, in my opinion, it's close to being the best performance in the movie. I really can't decide if it's her or Carradine as Jim Casey.
All right, let's put a pin in Carradine for just a minute because I want to keep talking about Darwell for just a second. Going back to your point about how the famous Fonda monologue seemed forced, this is where we get into like the end of the movie being different than the novel because the studio basically was like, hey, this movie is a freaking downer. And it's funny because it's like, did you not read this novel? Like you guys bought the rights. So they kind of made them tack on this happy ending after Tom Joad wanders off into oblivion. they come back and everybody's packing up again the next day. And then Ma Joad gives this kind of rousing speech at the end where she's like, they keep trying to keep us down, but we're the people, and the people will always rise back up because we're the people. And it is so at odds with the theme and and all of the actions of the movie up to that point, which is like, we should mourn for the average American and how they are being effed over by all of these other forces and how they're being kept down. And like, yes, I understand, Brad, that like there's like the we should unionize and that's our way to fight back. But even more than that, this movie is like, that book that came out like a decade ago, that Hillbilly Elegy book or whatever. Like, this movie is like an elegy for, middle America at this time. And that last speech was the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen, to the point where like it felt like they almost undermined Darwell's whole performance just to tack that thing on there.
Yeah. And that's why, like, if I could just cut out Fonda's final speech and her final speech, I think I would score this movie like 2.5 points higher. Like they really just kind of crush what this movie was going for. And like you said, that's not to say that there's not a lot of really beautiful stuff happening here. I just, it's I guess it's another example of the powerful studio pressure of ye olden days, kind of taking something that had direction and had vision and being pigeonholed into an ending that just didn't fit what Ford had been going for.
Yeah. All right, let's go back to the cast here. You want to talk about John Carradine?
Oh, dude. He gives speeches in this movie, and I'm just enraptured. Like, he's like that older guy that that just everything he says is philosophical, and just makes you think deeply about not just the world, but your own life, and go, I never thought about life that way before. I need to go drink a few beers.
He's very much, this is the character that even without reading the book seems the most like, oh, this is John Steinbeck sermonizing through a character. And I try not to hold it against Carradine, but it's very obvious. And this might be a good place to kind of segue into talking about Steinbeck. This is the second Steinbeck movie we've done on the podcast. And, Steinbeck is very famous for, I guess if I could say anything, like trying really hard to write the great American novel, trying to capture the idea of America in a book. And I think more than any other author, he's kind of successful at making the story of America be biblical in scope, right? And you find that in its most literal form in East of Eden.
Yep.
But he has this very biblical vision of like divine wrath and judgment and providence all running through his works. What makes Steinbeck's books kind of stand out as these books that either are the great American novels or are just trying so hard to be is that he's one of the few that understands that like you can't tell the story of America without dealing with the influence of religion on this country, right? Like there has to be, we had this with There Will Be Blood, where it's like, I may not agree with what Paul Thomas Anderson is saying here, but like he's shooting for the stars with like trying to pin down what America is with this conflict of capitalism and religion. And Steinbeck's doing the same thing here. And he's doing it through this preacher who has basically lost his faith and finds a new religion in like, to your term, like unionizing, like rising up with the people to fight back against these forces. Social justice, I guess we could call it. And it's really hard to know what is an element of the script and what's an element of Steinbeck. But this character also comes across a lot to me as like, this seems very forced. And this seems very like I am being force-fed the themes that they're trying to get across through this character.
But even in the midst of that, because I'm with you 100%, I don't know what it is about Carradine. I don't think we've ever had him on the show before.
He was in Stagecoach.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Man.
He was like the stuck-up guy that didn't like the hooker on the Stagecoach.
Oh, yeah. Maybe that's when he was still a pastor.
That tracks.
Yeah, so I guess the thing for me with Carradine is I just love his performance.
Yeah.
Like, similarly to Fonda, like, I don't always like what Fonda is saying, but I think he's a great actor. For some reason, I think maybe because I don't know Carradine as well, I just was enraptured every single time I saw him come on screen, and just loved the way he interacted with other people, how thoughtful he was when he gave answers. And maybe I liked his performance more because there's an element of his, in like character's backstory that makes more sense for him to be philosophizing and talking all these big ideas, and it makes sense. Like, this is a man of the cloth who has thought about the fate of humanity and all these things, and so it just kind of fits his character more, which I think lets me enjoy the cheesiness of his performance a little bit more.
All right, so for me, the character and the performance in this movie that will stay with me forever. And I don't even know if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but the actor's name is John Quaylen, or maybe Quallen. I don't know. We've had him on the show before once in a very, very minor part in Casablanca. But in this movie, he plays a character named Muley. And Muley shows up for like 10 minutes in the first half hour of this film. And this film starts in a very interesting way. Like, it starts and you think it's going somewhere. Tom Joad is going home to meet his family. He gets home and no one's there. And it's like a ghost town. And he goes in the house and there's this guy who's just like inhabiting his parents' empty home. And the whole scene is lit with candlelight and it looks like a ghost story. It looks like someone shining like a flashlight under their chin to tell a scary story. And you get...
It kind of reminded me of Gone with the Wind. When she returns.
Yep. That's a great point. And like, you get this flashback to how the banks kicked everybody off their land and there's nothing anyone can do about it. And they flash back forward and this dude Muley is such a broken man. And he is this actor, John Quaylen, is acting in such a naturalistic and frankly modern way that it's like stark. And it is heartbreaking. And I think haunted is the only word I can use, man. Like, the images of that man are the most profound thing in this movie to me.
Yeah. Well, in the speech that I guess he's like a foreman kind of gives of like, well, who am I going to go shoot to take care of this? And they just kind of go through the loop of like, well, the bankers they owe it to this company and they owe it to that. And if you do that, then you got to go all the way out to the East Coast. And it just kind of loops back to the fact that there's literally nothing Muley can do to save his land. And you feel in that moment the helplessness of it all. And when he collapses on the ground and is like, what is a man supposed to do? Like, what would make this his land any more than the fact that they have been born, lived, and died? Like, there's my family's
and his
blood.
Voice is like breaking, and he's like, and some of us have died here, and it's just like, oh my god, dude! Like, it's brutal. It's so heartbreaking. This movie, like, I know I'm not selling it to people, but like, I think if there's one thing I can really compliment this movie on, especially in the first half, it is that this movie is 82 years old now. And rarely have we seen a film that is as emotionally effective as this movie is. Like, I felt things watching this movie that I rarely feel watching movies that are made today. And I think that goes back to Ford. And we're going to talk about him in the second half of the episode. But it's so successful at making you feel the plight of these people.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know who the actor is, but the guy that they run into on the way to California, who like kind of won't tell them what the reality is, but they finally goad him into it.
Dude.
And when he talks about his family dying, I was done.
To the point where I can't believe they did that in a movie in 1940. Again, I don't want to call this movie subversive because it was like the book came out in 1939 and they immediately made a movie out of it. The book is going through this kind of backlash where people are calling it like a communist book, and the Red Scare was kind of going through America right before World War II. And they were really worried that this was going to play like a pro-communist movie, which again is like, did you guys read the book before you started making the movie? But you don't have people talking about watching their children starve to death in a movie in America in 1940. Like, it's shocking to see this on screen, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well, and it just plays so differently than all of the other movies that were coming out at the time. But it reflects what was going on in the West at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if there's anything about this movie that feels honest, it's when you go back and read actual historical accounts of the Dust Bowl and the migrant train moving west into California where there's supposed to be work, and the stories about the workers' camps that they would set up. I mean, dude, it was not pretty, man. Like, it was brutal what was happening out there.
Before we go to break, I hope this lightens things up a little bit, but it's also, again, the influence of The Grapes of Wrath. One of my all-time favorite TV shows, and I am not ashamed to admit it, is South Park. And South Park, especially in the really great seasons, was some of the best social commentary on television. And they did it in such a way that, like, they could disguise it behind this ridiculous childish humor. There's an episode of South Park called Margaritaville. And one of the subplots of that episode is that Stan's dad has bought this Margaritaville margarita maker, and it has been spending the family's money on frivolous things. And so Stan wants to return it. And so he takes it back to the store. I think he got it at Sur La Table. And and the guy at Sur La Table is like, oh, no, you don't want to go here. Like, we got this from this, warehousing or third-party seller. And he goes to the third-party seller, and the guy's like, no, this was all packaged in a tranche with blah, blah, blah. And it basically becomes like a metaphor for the housing crisis.
I want to return this Margaritaville, and the guy at Sur La Table said that you're the company that financed it.
Oh, yeah, no. You know what? No, yeah.
What?
Yeah, we can't give you your money back for that. Yeah, no. You'd have to talk to the people on Wall Street. Yeah.
Wall Street?
Yeah, no. See, what I do is find Americans who want a frozen beverage machine but can't afford one, and I hook them up with investors who want to get into the Margaritaville payment plan business. Yeah.
So?
Yeah, so the problem is your Margaritaville payment plan has been combined with thousands of others into one big Margaritaville security. Yeah, no. Yeah, no. Yeah.
And it is literally lifted from The Grapes of Wrath, where they're telling Muley, like, what do you want me to do? Like, I'm just the guy that sold it to you. The people that own it live in New York. Are you going to go all the way to New York? And it's so funny how the influence of this is still felt today. And yet at the same time, I think one of the lessons I took away from this movie was you could set this movie in 2022 and a lot of the same stuff is still happening. Like, it's kind of crazy how far we've gotten, chronologically from here and how little has changed in some ways.
Yeah. I mean, the way that people are at each other's throats feels, I don't know, weirdly prescient.
All right, man. Well, we need to drown our sorrows here. So let's flip over to a different kind of grapes here, and let's look at this rabbit hole finished in PX casks. What do you say?
Let's get to it.
All right, so today we are checking out Rabbit Hole Dareringer straight bourbon whiskey finished in PX casks. Brad, we've talked a little bit before about whiskeys that are finished in sherry casks. Pedro Jimenez sherry casks. It's a very specific kind of sherry that is made like in one little region in Spain. It is considered to be like one of the best when it comes to certain types of sherry. We've had a few PX finishes before. I don't know if we've ever done a bourbon finished in PX casks, and this Dareringer from Rabbit Hole is one of the, it's considered one of the best ones. This is actually the first thing from Rabbit Hole we've ever had on the show, which I'm super surprised at. There are a lot of really huge Rabbit Hole fans out there, and we've just never happened to stumble upon their product before. So we're starting not with their regular bourbon, but here with one of their finished products.
Yeah, and I've seen a ton of their stuff on the Instagrams and social media. And so, I'm with you, man. I'm really excited to get into Rabbit Hole. It's a brand I've, kind of seen from afar for a while now.
So this is a wheated bourbon. It's 68% corn, 18% wheat, 14% malted barley in the mash bill. It did carry an age statement of at least 5 years for a while. I don't know if they still have that statement on the bottle. We're drinking a sample from our friend Austin Dupree at the Bourbonering podcast, so I don't have the bottle in front of me and to know whether or not this is from when it was still 5-year age stated. But aside from all that, it's clocking in at 93 proof, so right in that kind of sweet spot range that we really like, Brad, where it's not too thin, not too potent yet. I'm really looking forward to this. I know you've already tasted it. I'm pouring it out in front of me right now. So why don't you give us your nosing notes, Brad?
Yeah, this had a ton of cherry and cinnamon on the front of the nose. After sitting with it for a little while, it kind of dove into that raisin feel. And then it took me a while to figure this out. It kind of just smells. I have this very specific memory of building a shed with my dad, and it had rained overnight unexpectedly, and we had left, some of the wood we were using out in the rain, and it just smells like wet wood. Mm-hmm. Like it's a very specific nose. It's not like like oaky or anything like that. It's this really like wet, musty wood smell that I'm kind of digging. I like what they're doing here. It's not blowing me away yet, so I gave it a 7.5 on the nose, Bob. But what are you getting right now?
Yeah, I'm actually coming out to something similar to what we used to call the Willet Funk. And when we revisited our last Willet product, which I think was Rowan's Creek, I realized that it's not actually really a funk. It's more of a rose that I get on this. But there's a certain dusty floral quality that comes with Willet products sometimes. And I'm getting that here. It's a ton of sawdust, but then a lot of floral, a lot of rose for me. I do get the raisin that you were talking about. I'm not so much getting the cherry. It's definitely got more of a dark fruit going on with it, which I really like. I will say, this smells a little bit more potent than I was expecting it to. I had to kind of pull my nose back out of the glass a couple times because the alcohol was really jumping out of the glass on this one for me. But I think overall, it's really inviting and it's right up my alley. So I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 on the nose.
Yeah, and then we get into the palate. The taste on this, I was really blown away by. I think the basic introduction I would give is just, it's incredibly pleasant. I think the 93 proof point is right where they needed to be with this. It had notes of grape jam, kind of got into a creamy cherry cordial feel. And then a lot of that oak started coming through. And I almost got a little bit of a weird pear note on the very back end of the palate. It started to get into some different fruits for me. I was really fascinated and really enjoyed this palette. I give it a 9 out of 10, Bob.
Yeah, I don't think I'm quite there with you, Brad. I like it, but it stays in that very dark fruit range for me. It's got almost a little bit of date on it for me, but I think the predominant note on this is prune. Not just raisin, but prune. So if you're not a fan of eating prunes, I don't know how you'll feel about this one, but it stayed not bitter, but definitely not syrupy sweet. And it is a little bit more spicy and kind of prickly than I would have thought at 93 proof. Right as I was tipping it up to my lips, I was kind of inhaling a bit and I just breathed in straight ethanol on this. And so, at only 93 proof, I'm a little shocked at how hot this drinks. I still think it's really good. It's not thin, it coats the mouth, but it's really prune heavy. And I think that's the influence, again, of these PX casks. I like it a lot. It's not a 9 for me. I'm going to give it a 7.5 on the taste.
Bob, don't you know you're not supposed to inhale? You're supposed to just let it sit in there a little bit.
Yeah.
That was something that, I don't smoke cigars enough to really know what I'm doing. But I just remember very early on when people were like, oh, you're not supposed to inhale. I was like, what are you talking
then why
about?
am I doing this? Yeah.
What are you doing?
just let this stick burn at the end of your lips.
Yeah. I've learned how to do it a little bit since then, but I just remember that being one of the most ridiculous statements.
All right. Before we go into the finish, the balance, I got a question for you because I just took my second and third sip of this and now I'm out. So I got the wheat influence on the second and third sip. It had a little bit of that kind of Coca-Cola effervescence that I talk about all the time with wheat whiskeys. I don't know that the sherry finish on a wheated bourbon is the combination I necessarily would have wanted here. Like, I wonder if this would have worked better with a high rye bourbon instead of a higher wheat bourbon. And I just would really like to know your thoughts on this.
I mean, I think that you're kind of hitting a similar vein of flavors with the sherry finished high wheat bourbon, which it just kind of depends. Like, do you want that similar flavor being strengthened, or do you want the complexity of, you know, the baking spices you might get on a rye paired with some of those sweet raisiny notes that you would get from the sherry? For me, I think it works on this in the palate. The finish we haven't gotten to yet, I was a little not as strong with. So I don't know. I guess I'd say it's probably just personal preference.
Yeah. I mean, I'm anxious to hear what your finish score is. Since I'm talking, I'll just give mine real quick. I kind of forgot about the finish already, if I'm being honest with you. It was fine. I do think it's where the wheat influence comes back a little bit. So it's like very heavily sherried, very heavily pruny. And then it's like, oh, hey, remember what root beer tastes like? Here's a little bit of that on the end. It was a weird mashup for me. And I think that's where I started to have questions about the mashup of these two things. So I'm going to give it a 7 on the finish. It's not bad, but it just was off enough to make me start asking questions.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that the finish for me, it was very short. I got some raisin notes. It definitely got oaky and just slightly bitter. I came down pretty far from the palate to the finish. I'll give it a 6.5 on the finish.
Wow. All right, so that's gonna put you in an interesting spot for balance, right?
Yeah, well, I gave it a 7 on balance. It's an up and down experience of a whiskey, but I will say that it was decently complex throughout. And I think the complexity of flavors that I get keeps the balance score a little higher. It's definitely a really tasty whiskey. It just the nose and finish are a little bit lacking compared to the palate.
I do think it's worth reminding listeners how we determine what we call balance here. And I think a lot of times when someone's tasting something and they talk about the balance of the taste, they're just basically saying, like, are all the flavors in harmony with each other? And we kind of take that into consideration. But what this really is like a chronological from start to finish. Was there a part of this drinking experience that was like significantly worse or significantly better than the rest of it? Or is it a nice, consistent experience throughout? That's what we consider to be balance. And I think you're right, Brett. It does kind of drop off a little bit from the nose through to the finish. I'm going to give it a 7.5 on the balance. And that brings me out before the value score to a 30 so far. Brad, what does this cost in the state of Ohio?
This is an $80 bottle of whiskey.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's the thing. Yep. I really want to get Rabbit Hole's master distiller on the podcast. And I have a feeling that this is not going to be like the bait that I was thinking it would be. Man, 80's too much, Brad. Like I can't even play the game of like, well, you know, it's a really small batch and blah, blah, blah. 80's too much for this.
Yeah.
I would even say like 60 is too much for this.
I think so too. I think this is like a $40 to $50 bottle of whiskey.
Yeah, just based on the taste, right? I mean, like
just based on the taste.
We know what goes into the process.
Yes. Yeah, the acquisition of these very specific sherry barrels to finish it in, like there's a lot going in here. $60 is probably a fair price point for it. But based on the flavor here, I think $80 is a little bit steep. I give it a 5 out of 10 on value. It's solid in the realm of finished whiskeys, but not great enough to be an $80 bottle.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a 4.5 on value. That brings me out to a 34.5 out of 50. Brad, what are you coming out to?
I'm right there with you, man. I'm at a 35 out of 50.
All right, so that brings us to a 69.5 out of 100, or a 34.75 out of 50. This is right below the 35 mark, which is where we usually start recommending, hey, you should try this at the bar, or you should go out and get a bottle. I think this is worth trying. This is not a bad whiskey.
Yeah.
But I would definitely recommend trying rather than buying.
Yeah, I would say that there's this kind of fine line of like, if this whiskey costs like $40, and a pour of it cost, $10 to $12, I'd be like, just buy the bottle. But at $80, you're only going to pay $9 to $12 for a pour. And I would say that that's well worth it. It really is an incredible palate that kind of keeps this score high for me. So I think it's a worthwhile whiskey to try, just struggles enough that it doesn't justify the price tag.
All right, that's our thoughts on Rabbit Hole PX Finish. Brad, let's get back into talking about the Grapes of Wrath. What do you say?
Let's get to it. All right, everybody, that was Rabbit Hole PX Finish. We just finished talking about a grape-finished whiskey, and now we're going to get back into a grape-themed movie.
I love this
Bob,
so
back
much.
to you.
I love this so much. I've been trying real hard to pair up the whiskeys with the movies in a much more cohesive fashion lately. And this is like, you got to do the grape theme,
It's pretty obvious, Bob. I'm with you there.
All right, now that we're nice and liquored up, it is time for Brad's favorite segment of the show, which we should just be calling Annihilate Bob's Confidence in Himself.
Hey, man, you're doing pretty good.
I think I'm like 1 over 500. I think I'm 7 and 6 right now.
7 and 6 is your record.
All right. Well, all right. So anyway, this segment is called 2 Facts and a Falsehood. This is where Brad presents 3 things as fact about this movie, and I have to decide which one of them he completely made up. Fact
number 1, John Steinbeck. Have you heard of him, Bob?
I have.
He really loved the... Fact. All right, moving on to the next one. Steinbeck really, truly loved the performance of Henry Fonda as Tom Joad and just really felt like he perfectly encapsulated all the things he wanted to convey with the character. So much to the point that the two became really, really great friends. And Henry Fonda did a reading at Steinbeck's funeral.
Wow. Hey, guess what? John Steinbeck was wrong.
I'm just, hey, man,
I don't care what your authorial intent was. He was miscast.
Maybe that's the falsehood.
That's true.
Fact number 2, Henry Fonda was so afraid of portraying the role poorly that he actually spent an entire month working in a migrant camp in California to really make sure he understood the conditions that he would be acting in. And he was all about it. He got in care. He pulled a De Niro Taxi Driver situation.
There you go.
Fact number 3, Henry Fonda currently holds the record for the longest gap between acting Oscar nominations. His first nomination was for The Grapes of Wrath in 1940, and his second was for On Golden Pond in, do you know the year, Bob?
81?
1981.
Yeah.
Good job. You got a quarter point.
You're saying he was only nominated twice?
I'm saying that is the longest gap between acting nominations. Huh. Maybe he was nominated before that and after that, but that was the gap between those two.
Was he nominated for 12 Angry Men? Because that's I know he was obviously nominated for On Golden Pond because he wins for that movie. I find it hard to believe that Henry Fonda was not nominated for 41 years in between these roles. However, I also find it hard to believe that Henry Fonda went and worked on a migrant farm. And this is
all about it, man.
This is the dilemma. I think that
the idea that Steinbeck would have liked his performance, ridiculous.
I think that I am going to be wrong regardless of what I pick. So, I felt pretty strongly that number 2 was false. I feel very skeptical about number 3, but I'm going to go with my gut and say 2 is the falsehood.
Bob, number 2 is the falsehood.
Yeah.
You got it, man.
All right.
Yeah.
Man, what Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, what the hell were you doing for 41 years?
Yeah. Now, he was nominated for 12 Angry Men as a producer. He was not nominated as an actor.
Wow, that's surprising.
Yeah. I know.
Huh.
I read that and I was like, wait a second.
Hold on.
He didn't get nominated for 12 Angry Men?
That's crazy, man. The Academy is off its rocker.
It really is. I'm trying to remember. Was the Red Scare kind of over by then? By 58, was it?
I feel like it was probably winding down a bit, but it was still there.
Because that might be a reason he
That's
didn't
true.
get nominated.
That's true.
That'd be a guess.
All right, man.
But-
Well, I'm going to bask in the glow of my win. I'm up to 8 and
Yeah,
6
congrats,
now.
dude.
Thanks, man.
You're killing it.
Let's talk about John Ford, because he is the reason we're talking about this movie today, and we have not mentioned him like at all yet. And there's a few things you need to know about John Ford. He is one of the first directors to be considered an auteur. And we've talked a little bit about the auteur theory here. I don't really want to get into the specifics of it, Brad, but like
just give the basics. What's an auteur?
So the idea of an auteur is that like the director is the author of the film, right? And this has been misinterpreted in a lot of ways over the years. It gets very technical about like what that means. But like in the 1950s in France, in, this magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma, they're doing this really high level analysis of film and basically trying to present like, hey, film is an artistic medium that should be regarded as seriously as these other artistic mediums. And we're going to hold up certain directors and talk about how they have themes running across their pictures and how you can see the author behind the movie. And John Ford is one of the first people that is really held up as like, this is one of our great directors. And, he had been lauded in America. Like I think he won 4 best directing Oscars. Like he still holds the record for most best director wins. But, he directed Westerns. And I think Westerns were kind of seen as like the people's movies. So like they weren't talked about in these super artistic ways. And yet, like when you watch a movie like The Searchers or you watch a movie like this and you look at the way that this man put images on screen, it's pretty striking, Brad. Even if a lot of his movies are just kind of like the quote unquote cowboys and Indians type movies, there always seems to be a little something more going on.
Yeah, it seems like he has an ability to draw the strings of like what's going on in America at the time into every single one of his movies.
Yeah, you're right. He always seems to be trying to like mythologize about America. And the cool thing about Ford, though, is that like there are certain movies where it seems like he is feeding into the myth of like American exceptionalism. You know what I mean? Like we deserve to be here and like F all these Native Americans. You know what I mean? And then there's other movies where he's like, no, actually the myth of America is just that. Like none of this is real. And we are creating legends about the Old West in ways that the Old West never existed. One of his most famous movies is called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And that whole movie is about this story of a guy who's gotten really famous off of an act he committed of like shooting a famous outlaw. It's very much like the assassination of Jesse James. And at the end of that movie, you get this famous line about how when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. And it's this like agreement that we've all made that like, we're not going to examine what really happened because it's a better story to tell like the mythology of it. And so Ford kind of goes back and forth between propping up that myth and then like tearing it down again. And The Grapes of Wrath is such an interesting movie in his canon because it is very much, this is what America really looks like. And this is what it looks like right now. I think that's one thing we forget about this movie. This was happening in real life at the time this movie came out. It was almost like he was trying to make a documentary of this is what life is like for these migrant workers. And that's a really rare thing to get in Hollywood. We don't get movies about current events as they're happening. And yet here's Ford doing it.
It's almost like the modern version of The Grapes of Wrath is Childish Gambino's This Is America.
I was just reading an article the other day about Zero Dark 30, a movie which we may or may not be reviewing this season, and how like that's one of the few movies about the Iraq War or the war in Afghanistan, our Middle Eastern activities that came out while we were still there. And yet it's very famously a movie that the CIA was like feeding them information on. And so it's like, here's what the government wants you to think happened in that scenario. And so it's even more of like this. It's just crazy to me that this movie gets made, that this book gets written, and that it captures the attention of Americans in such a profound way, like while it's happening.
Well, I mean, in the research that I was doing for Two Facts and a Falsehood, they basically said that they had to they filmed this under the code name, I think it was Route 66, to keep the workers in the area from knowing what they were filming, because the book was so explosive. And, you know, we talked earlier about the unionization movement and all that, but they were like terrified that people were going to come protest this movie because of what it was saying about the current goings on of America. And, you know, I guess it just goes to prove that, like, you know, we think that nowadays it's dangerous to talk about what's going on in America right now. But, like, man, it's always been a little bit crazy to do politically motivated proclamations
Right.
in the midst of, you know, the craziness that can be people trying to run a country together.
Well, and I think this is where you can most immediately see why Ford is considered such a strong director, because this movie becomes so successful that it then drives more sales of the book. And, you know, the book was so controversial until the movie came out. And then the movie came out and people were like, oh, I get it now. Like, I'm on Henry Fonda's side now. I almost said Henry Ford. That's the opposite of what this movie's about. But people are like, I'm on Henry Fonda's side. And it plays into the power of movie making, the power of putting this face on a screen 40 feet tall and showing people, you know, whether it's real or not, the plight of what's happening in America. That this then, like, gets everybody on the side of the point of view of Steinbeck. And
yeah,
I want to go back real quick. I was reading an article today about John Ford and why he's considered an auteur. And I'm going to read a quote from that, and then there's a quote within a quote. But the author of this article says, perhaps the image which most dominates Ford's legacy today is the last shot of John Wayne standing alone in the desert as the door closes to shut him out. This is in The Searchers. We'll talk about this next week. It's the ultimate expression of what's been identified as the Fordian hero, a figure who is necessary to solve society's problems, but tragically unable to enjoy them. Which you see with Tom Joad in this movie, right? And then he goes on to say, as John Baxter wrote in a 1971 analysis of Ford's work, Ford makes most of his heroes outsiders, chronic wanderers who accept the necessity of serving society, admire its virtues, secretly wish to be part of it, but are driven by personal motives to reject its security. This is something we're going to keep seeing with Ford, that his heroes are almost always loners, almost always outsiders, that there's something like inherent to society that pushes them out, whether it's their own flaws or it's a flaw with society. And I think when you frame it that way, this movie makes a lot of sense in film, in Ford's filmography. Like, he clearly sees Tom Joad as the hero who is a victim of a society that won't accept people like him. And I don't know, man, whether it's successful or not, I think I'd like to hear from you, Brad, but I think that's kind of how we're framing this movie in Ford's filmography.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating way to talk about an archetypal character. And you see in the public consciousness that, I mean, look at our 2016 election. Like, Trump completely ran on the idea of, like, I'm an outsider to the world of politics who can come in and, like, get things done. And I think that people really latched onto that. And, you know, you see that even in other movies. Like, as soon as you started talking about the character, I was like, oh, all I could see was the opening of Gladiator, when Richard Harris is trying to pass the throne on to Maximus, right? He literally gives the speech that you just gave. Like, we don't need another spoiled brat who's been brought up in the system. We need somebody from the outside who doesn't care for the trappings of the throne and who can guide us into a better future. Like, that's 60 years after this film comes out. You know, that wins the Oscar.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that it's a fascinating... I don't know. I love the idea of these archetypal characters that just capture the public's imagination, because I think that we've seen that idea of the outsider stick in the public consciousness. And I wonder if it's partially just because of how popular John Ford was as a director.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say, too, that, like, Ford views these people as tragic heroes, right? Like, they are ultimately doomed to be rejected by society or to be loners and to stay loners. Like, they're heroic and also a figure of tragedy. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, let's go into...
I was going to say, look at Bogart in Casablanca.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like he's more of an anti-hero, but, like, this is kind of the precursor to the anti-hero, right? Like, this is the precursor to what you see in, like, film noir, right? Like the rough-edged guy. But here it's like he's a victim of forces that are beyond his control. And I think about a comparison you made. If we're getting into our new segment, let's make it a double, where we talk about pairing this up with another movie. I think The Dark Knight is actually a really, really great comparison, Brad. Like, because that is exactly what the end of that movie is about. That, like, he is doomed. Batman is doomed to be a figure who is rejected by society, and we will never understand why we needed him, but we need him, and we just don't get it yet, and he's a victim of that. That is as explicit as that can possibly get. So, I mean, I don't want to take your pick for you, but, like, I feel like you already had the best possible pick here. If I was going to pick a movie to lighten things up here at the end of our episode, Brad, I'm going to choose a movie that is also about a man who unfortunately killed another man in a drunken bar fight, who's just getting out of prison, who wants to go home and see his family, and yet his family is being taken from him on his westward flight. And when I say westward flight, I mean a literal flight, because I'm talking about Nicolas Cage in Con Air. I want to pair this I want to pair this movie up with Con Air, which is, again, a real and true metaphor for life in the American West, this time in the late 1990s, when your plane gets hijacked by John Malkovich.
Bob, I have never seen Con Air.
You have now, because you've seen The Grapes of Wrath.
Oh, okay.
What I'm saying is, it is The Grapes of Wrath of the 1990s.
That is amazing, man. Yeah, man. The way that you were talking just a minute ago about, a movie with a hero where things are just completely out of his control, it kind of got me thinking, and we're going to stay in the vein of Western, but we're going to come to a much more modern Western. I think I'm going to pair this because I want the ending of this movie to be more depressing. So I'm going to pick a movie that's a little more depressing. Where am I going, Bob?
You're going to pick No Country for Old Men.
I'm going to pick No Country for Old Men.
Yeah, you are. Good choice. And we once again get to hear your incredible pronunciation of No Country for Old Men.
That's right. No Country for Gary Oldman.
Oh, man. I like it. I do kind of, I mean, again, we don't want to spoil the ending of the book, but, like, just get on Wikipedia. This book is bleak.
Mm-hmm.
Like, really bleak. And I feel like Cormac McCarthy and the Coen brothers would be happy.
I would say it's about as bleak as Anton Chigurh's outlook on life.
All right, there you have it. 3 really good picks from both of us. If I do say so myself, Con Air is the most obvious of the 3. Like, come on. Why would you not watch Con Air? Brad, let's get into final scores here. Just put quite frankly, this is a really good movie that is not the 22nd greatest film ever made.
Mm-mm.
And I'm actually really surprised to see it that high on the list, because there's a few movies like this on the list that are kind of like, they're never debated, but I never hear anyone talk about them either. And so, like, yep. I have never seen someone on, like, Twitter or whatever be like, hey, how about The Grapes of Wrath? Like, The Searchers gets all the conversation because it's controversial, but at least it's getting conversation. I have literally never seen a conversation about the movie The Grapes of Wrath. And so, like...
You just had one.
Yeah, right? We're the first.
We are the first.
We're going to get all the views on this one, man. But this is like an 8.5, Brad. And I feel like it could have been a 10 if it had stuck with the tone of the first half of the movie. But it settles into a really conventional story in the second half, and I just feel like it loses a lot of steam for me. So I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10.
Yeah, I think that this movie starts with like a 9.5 out of 10 and drops to like a 7 out of 10 by the end of the movie. I really, really lost interest in this movie. And that's not a good thing to say. So I think I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10, Bob.
All right, that brings us to an average of an 8 out of 10, which, I mean, is fair. And I think that, again, it's maybe the great American novel, debatable, but this is a movie that was really important 80 years ago that still has many, many effective sequences 80 years later, but it's just not a perfect film. And I don't know that I would even call it anywhere approaching John Ford's best film. Mm-hmm. But we'd like to know what you think. Are you a huge fan of the book or the movie, The Grapes of Wrath? You can find us on our social media to tell us all about it. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok @FilmWhiskey.
Or you can jump onto our Discord. We, as Bob said before, we're on there every single day talking to you guys, the people who listen to our podcast. You can find a link to our Discord at the end of every single one of our show notes.
Next week, we keep the John Ford train rolling here, and we're going to be looking at his most controversial film, The Searchers. Join us for that next week, but until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.